Hello, my name is Charity Ritchie. Brooklyn Sawyer and I will be presenting on the Oka crisis. And in my section, I will be discussing the year of the Oka crisis and the event itself, as well as some of the things that weren't talked about during the reporting. Many of us are familiar with the Oka crisis, but for those who aren't familiar, I will give a very short summary of the event. This event happened primarily between the Mohawk Conestoga people in Quebec and between the government, law enforcement, and a large number of non-Indigenous Quebecers. Basically, what led to this was a long history of land dispute, of ownership over the Mohawk territory, and I'll get more into detail about this later on in the presentation. But years before the crisis of 1990, the municipal government started up a golf course, which was right along sacred burial grounds. Years later, the municipal government announced that it would extend the golf course. However, it would be going into sacred Indigenous burial grounds. And to us, Indigenous people, burial grounds are extremely important to us and will always be protected at every cost. And this is what happened with the Conestoga people. They gathered and decided that they would not let the government mistreat them anymore, and they would not allow um, the municipal government's encroachment on sacred burial lands to extend a golf course. A quote from one of the Conestoga warriors says, "The whole village was built on Indian land. They used and enjoyed our forest land too. We welcomed them, then they wanted to add an extra 9 holes to their private golf course by cutting down the sacred pine forest we planted and where our ancestor or our ancient burial grounds are located. This was too much to swallow, and we refused to let our dead be disturbed or to let them use our land for selfish purpose." Unquote. And so then, in order to stop the construction for the golf course that would go into their sacred burial grounds, they began their resistance. The people of the Conestoga, Kanewake, and Akwesasne, and pardon me if I'm saying that wrong, but they began to protest and create barricades to protect the land. When they were told to move um, by the law enforcement and the SQ, the Indigenous people refused to move. Because the law enforcement became violent by throwing tear gas and grenades at the Indigenous people, in 1990, even more violence grew to the point where guns were being involved, which in part caused the crisis. This continued for a lengthy period of time, and barricades moved to major highways, bridges, and in result of this, the locals were they became angry and caused a lot of racism, anger, violence from the non-Indigenous people. This was a long period of fighting, violence, barricades from both the Indigenous and non-Indigenous people at this point. There was a lot of protesting and resistance and incredible activism from the Indigenous nations all around Canada. In an attempt to settle this matter, the Indigenous people and government met, and the Indigenous people were refused by the government to stop the construction as well as have land sovereignty. This grew even more resistance. The Conestoga continued to protest and barricade, but the law enforcement kept using violence against the Indigenous people. After 78 days straight of this, the Indigenous people took down their barricades. To conclude, the government purchased the sacred burial grounds. The golf course was stopped. However, the issue of land sovereignty was never dealt with. Now that I have given a short summary, I'm going to be discussing a report. I've done my best to research for reports on the 1990 Oka crisis. However, when I was looking through the archives for reports around that time, it seemed to me that there were a lot of missing reports. Certain years were missing, and it seemed a bit spotty, if you know what I mean. But anyways, this was the report that I was able to find, and it was posted in the year 2000.
The Magazine with Francine Pelche.
Good evening. It happened 10 years ago tomorrow, just west of Montreal. Oka shook Canada out of any complacency it might have had about Native issues. It took a volley of bullets, the death of a police officer, and a seemingly endless standoff. But the standoff did end. Yet long after the media headed home and turned its attention to other issues, communities across the country remained profoundly marked by the event. Tonight we look at those who still struggle with this legacy. The magazine's Joan Leishman went to Oka and beyond to bring us this.
It wasn't a call to come to war, it was a call to be recognized.
We're far outnumbered, we're outgunned. There's always going to be bitterness.
Come on! Go! Go! Come on! Again! Come on!
The summer of 1990. Canada turns its guns on Mohawk Indians. It begins as a peaceful protest. Mohawks trying to stop the expansion of a golf course onto land that they consider theirs. The Quebec police is called in to remove the Indians. In a skirmish, a police officer is shot dead. The army moves in. 78 days later, it's over.
The Magazine.
Oops. Okay. So I didn't play the full report for the sake of time, but I played the main part of it in the area that speaks about the Oka crisis. So right away and at the beginning of the media report, we can see that the majority of the report is primarily just of the Indigenous people getting up in the faces of the law enforcement, and we can see them swearing and trying to intimidate the law enforcement, starting fires and other things like setting up blockades and whatnot, like stuff like that. And a major thing that they are missing is how the Indigenous people were being treated with violence. They didn't show much of the law enforcement shooting the protesters, throwing grenades at them, hitting them with rocks, spraying them with tear gas, or highly pressurized water, or flying around the Indigenous people with helicopters. I personally think they intentionally displayed things this way to make the law enforcement seem calm and noble, and to depict the Indigenous people as the opposite. That's just my opinion. Another thing that caught my attention was when she was talking about how the Mohawks were stopping the expansion on the land that they, quote, consider theirs. She said they consider theirs. We can see that their reporting did not go deep at all. When she says consider theirs, it's almost gives off the tone that she doesn't believe that the land actually belonged to them, to the Indigenous people in a way. I definitely think she should have incorporated more context behind what she said, because the land in fact did belong to the Indigenous people, and the land dispute between the Indigenous people and the Europeans in this area began in the late 17th and 18th century. In a condensed summary, as European settlement was happening, the forced colonization of indigenous people was beginning to happen. The more that Europeans encroached the land, they began to push indigenous people into different territories. The church and the people of the Saint Sulpice came in onto the indigenous territory and began to colonize them. The territory that they were on was secretly granted to the seminary of the Saint Sulpice of the French Roman Catholic Church. Sorry, that got me tongue twisted. By King Louis of France to evangelize the Mohawks and to relocate them. The indigenous people agreed to relocate because it was agreed that the land that they were moving to was already a part of their traditional hunting grounds, and the Saint Sulpice promised that they would be given ownership of the land that they were locating to, and they wouldn't be moved anymore, which is now the area that the indigenous people are in. This promise was recorded in a wampum belt to honor their agreement. Many years later, as the king did grant, and this was without the knowledge of the indigenous people, the land rights to the Saint Sulpice. Sorry for mispronouncing that. And they ended up breaking their promise and agreement that they made with the Mohawks and ended up selling the land to the European settlers. For many of the years, Mohawks fought their land claims to the British authorities and made many attempts to regain legal authority of the land, especially in years like 1781, 1787, and 1785, as well as the beginning and the middle of the 1800s. And also many times in the years of post-Confederation in the mid to late 1800s and so on. And for many years, this fight continues and still does.